guys, I just wanted to review a new book that I came across at my local library that I think you might find of interest, and I'm going to probably pick up a copy of this for myself. I really like this book. It's a bit pricey, but I think it's well worth it. The book is Vogue Knitting, the Ultimate Knitting Book, and it is very, very nice. This came out, I think, the first of this year, 2018, and it's got an awful lot of information in it. I believe the retail on this is $40 US, $39.95, but I think it's well worth it. I'm going to look around on the internet and see if I can find it a little less expensive. I think I might be able to get a fairly decent price on it. But anyway, I wanted to review this book and show some of the sections to you, so you kind of get an idea for yourself. But for someone who's been knitting as long as I have been, it's really nice to find a resource that has some of the newer techniques in it all in one place. So I would like to, without any further ado, kind of go into the book a little bit, do a little bit of review on it, and then we'll conclude from there. Now, apparently this book has been out in different incarnations over the years, and this is the most recent edition. And it's by Vogue. And it contains an awful lot of very useful information. And it says this is a completely revised and updated version. And I'd like to tell you a little bit of what it's got in here on the table of contents. Most of the books that you'll run into, your knitting books, will have your yarns and supplies. This one does as well. Talks about basic techniques, and that's how to begin knitting. You know, casting on, casting off, binding off, whatever you want to call it, how to do the simple stitches, how to count stitches, that type of thing. It talks about cabling. It's got quite a section on cabling where it reviews that. Color knitting, lace, circular knitting, directional knitting, advanced techniques, understanding instructions, which is very helpful, correcting errors. This in itself is probably worth the book to me. Over the years, I've made just about every kind of error you can think of to make when it comes to knitting. How to finish your work, that's seaming and blocking and all that kind of good stuff. How to design sweaters. I'm just starting to get into designing, and that's why I'm primarily really interested in this book, because it has a section, actually a couple, 2 or 3 different sections on how to design things. It has quite an extensive section on designing sweaters, designing shawls, another section on designing accessories, and then also the last section is embellishments, and then it also has a section on caring for your knitwear. And I'm just going to briefly go through some of the sections here. This I thought was very helpful. It talks about your different yarns, weights and whatnot, and what size needles go with those. That was like right in the first section of the book, and I thought that was very helpful. That's your yarn and supplies section. And it talks about the different weights of yarns and what needles go with those. It also goes in a little detail on the different yarn fibers, how those work. And it talks about your tools, your knitting needles, and all your accessories that you need to knit. And it explains what those are used for and the types. This is very similar to what I had before in that vintage book. And it gives a little detail on the structure of knitting, what it looks like, you know, how the stitches form. Interlocking the knit stitches or interlocking a purl, so it shows you what that looks like. It has like a close-up of those, so you can kind of tell by looking at that. I'll just show you real quickly here what they're talking about. So you can kind of look at it. You can see the V's that are in the stockinette on the knit stitch, and then you can see like on the purl bumps. And also in the cabling section, it talks about cables, how to understand cables. There's symbols for cabling that you could see in charts and whatnot. Gives quite a bit of detail on how to do your cabling, how to read your charts, different types of cables. Here's basic cable stitches and symbols. And a whole page almost on that, with examples to the right or to the left of that. This shows what it looks like when they're talking about back right cable, and it shows how that's done and what it looks like. Then they've got front left cable and what that looks like. So it goes into quite a lot of detail on how to do cabling and what the cabling is. Very, very helpful on that. I like the way this book is set up and laid out. I think it's very, very helpful. It's got quite an extensive section on color knitting, which is stranded knitting and tarsia, bobbins that you use to interchange the different colors of yarn that you'll be using, charts for that, horizontal stripes, how to do those, vertical striping, which is kind of neat. Normally you'll do horizontal striping and knitting, but it's kind of, I think, a newer type thing to see what a vertical stripe looks like. That's new to me. It's probably been around for a while, but how to do slip stitches, mosaic knitting. Now that other book, those books that I showed you earlier on the vintage one, has quite a bit of stuff on this too. So this isn't brand new, but it's just showing it in a little different way. Short row color knitting and plaid knitting. The other books, the vintage books, had plaid knitting as well. So, but it goes into the history of Fair Isle knitting. Some of you guys are probably pretty familiar with that. And it shows that, where it became popular back in the early part of the 20th century with King of England. Actually, the Prince of Wales was starting to wear, he popularized Fair Isle sweaters over in the UK, and it kind of caught on across the pond here. And they've been kind of in and out of popularity ever since. So, since probably about the 20s. King Edward, I guess he was never really officially called king, but Edward, I don't remember what his number was, but the Prince of Wales, the guy that abdicated to marry Mrs. Simpson, he was the gentleman that popularized the Fair Isle sweaters. He was golfing in one, and a lot of photographers came out, and he was quite a popular guy in his day. And they came out and saw him, and the sweaters themselves kind of took off. Prior to that, they were worn more by, working people, fishermen, and, people that worked, farmers and whatnot, because they were very warm because of the color stranding. And you can see there's a Nordic down there with the yoke there. But it talks about your Fair Isle knitting and color knitting that way and how it got popularized, which is nice. It's nice to have a little bit of history on that stuff. And then it goes into detail on how to do the different techniques along with that, and correcting mistakes, how to read it. It's got a whole section on lace knitting. And basically lace is just yarn overs and decreases. Very simple. I didn't know how to do lace until just recently. I was always afraid to try it. And once I found out that's all it was like, oh, okay. I don't think that's going to be that big of a deal, and it wasn't. So if you're afraid to try something, maybe go out on YouTube and see what they talk about when it comes to doing that stuff. A lot of this stuff looks really complicated. It isn't. Once you get into it, it's like, oh, is that all it is? Okay, I think I can handle that. So anyway, it's got introduction to lace, yarn overs, decreases, reading your lace charts, shaping, borders, blocking lace, and correcting mistakes while you're knitting in lace. So I won't go through that entire section, but I'll give you an idea what's in there. Also has quite an extensive section on circular knitting. And that's basically knitting in the round, where instead of knitting in a flat piece, you're knitting it all the way around. And basically it's a spiral. And it talks about how to do that, how to join things, how to do a jogless join when you're, you can when you're doing the spiral thing, you'll get like a jog in there, and it'll show you how to eliminate that. You can also find that on YouTube, but it's nice to have this in this book for reference. And it talks about your equipment, what you need to do circular knitting, which is either double pointed needles, DPNs, or circular needles. And for those of you who don't know, there's two little needles with a cord that goes, attaches them together. So anyway, they talk about the different techniques, like your magic loop, or 2 at a time, or 2 needles at a time, or doing double pointed needles. It also talks about steeking, and you'll use that when you're doing, basically that's cutting your knitting. And I didn't know what that was myself until a couple years ago. And I started watching people that were doing color knitting, and they were talking about steeking. And I thought, what is that? And what you do is to make like a cardigan out of a one-piece sweater, you reinforce a section, generally in the center of the front of the sweater, and you reinforce that, and you then cut it. And then you work up the edges or cover the edges up in a certain way. You put other stitches on it or whatever. And what the steeking does is it keeps it from unraveling later on and ruining all your hard work. So it's got a whole section on how to do that, how to make a Mobius cowl. And that's a cowl that twists in the center. And it's all one piece. And there's also quite a section in there on directional knitting. And that would be your entrelac and how to knit that in a round. Popular or modular knitting, bias knitting, center out squares, center out circles, center out geometric shapes, and center out stars. And this will kind of give you an idea when they're talking about, you know, different shapes. Now there's a baby blanket that's been quite popular of late, and it's these squares. And they're put together that way where you make like little squares out of it. And that's something I've been wanting to try. And I just got a book on one of my hauls that's got a baby blanket in there with those types of squares. And I'm going to give that a shot, I think, one of these days in the not too distant future. But anyway, that's that section. Then it also has a section on double knitting. I've heard of double knitting. It's not the DK yarn, it's double knitting itself. I wasn't really sure what that is. I haven't read this section, but I'm going to go back and take a look at that and what they talk about when they talk about how to double knit. And I would assume double knitting would be double thickness. We'll see. I'm sure if any of you guys out there know what double knitting is or you've done it, how about leaving me a comment and letting me know what that is and what your experience has been with it. I'd really appreciate that. It also shows you how to do tucks in your work. So if you want to put a little tuck or a crease or whatever in something, you can do that. And it talks about loop stitch. Loop stitch is in one of there's a number of loop stitch things in those vintage books I showed you earlier. It also gives quite a bit. There's a whole section in here on understanding written instructions or instructions, the charts. Gives you schematics, gauge, counting rows, knitting abbreviations explained and crochet abbreviations explained, knitting terminology explained, symbols and unusual and alternative symbols. It also gives quite a listing here of sizing. I thought it was kind of neat. Now you could probably get some of this off the internet. I've seen a lot of this, but this is probably maybe a little bit more standardized. But that's all your different sizing for babies all the way up to men, women, children, you name them. The fit and ease, what you need to have on that so it fits right. Talks about your gauge and how important that is. I know that myself. I learned that the hard way. I told you about that earlier. Years ago, I made this really nice Aran sweater. Beautiful. It had a lot of cabling on it. First time I did cabling, a lot of moss stitch, which takes a while to do. I love that thing. And got it done. It took me months to make it. And I was new to knitting at that time, and I didn't realize how important getting gauge was. I figured, hey, as long as I got the right kind of needles. I was new to knitting at that time, and I thought, well, hey, according to the pattern, I need whatever it was. It might have been size 8 needles. And I needed to use worsted weight yarn, which I did. So I figured, hey, as long as I've got that, I've got the size 8 needles, and I've got the worsted weight yarn, and I'm following the pattern, I put the right amount of stitches in there, it should fit me. So I made it according to my size. And it looked pretty good while I was doing it. Then I went to try it on, and guess what? The darn thing was about 4 sizes too big. I couldn't get, I said, oh no. So I spent months on that darn thing, and I could never wear it. And that was a lot of money, and it was a lot of time wasted. So I learned the hard way from that. Anything that I make, I want to get the gauge or get something fairly close to what the gauge is. So especially for a sweater or something where it's very important that it fits you, it's not so much of a consideration when it comes to a shawl or a scarf or whatever. you know, that's a little bit more forgiving. If it's an inch or two too long either way, or an inch or two too small either way, it's not really going to make that much of a difference. But when it comes to something that's more form-fitting, like a sweater or a cardigan or a hat, you want something that's going to fit you. Else, why would you spend all that time knitting it or crocheting it, whichever you're doing? So pay attention to the gauge. Now, you don't have to spend a ton of time on it. I don't make up a 4-inch swatch or whatever they call it. I never make the entire swatch up. Now, maybe what I do is make up maybe a 3-inch swatch. And think maybe myself, this is my personal opinion, I think maybe going with a 4-inch thing might be a little too much. But you got to go maybe a 3-inch thing and measure it out and see where you're at. And it'll give you enough to go off of. But anyway, gauge is important. So, hey, if anybody would want to comment on some of the experience they've had with gauge, I'd sure appreciate it. I'd like to see if hopefully I'm not the only one that's done something like that. And it also gives quite a section in here on knitting abbreviations explained, which is nice too. I've seen a lot of, I had to look up on the internet. I was making a little cardigan type thing. It was like a little bolero cardigan I made up a couple years ago. And it had a symbol I've never seen, or an abbreviation I'd never seen before. And I had a heck of a time finding something on that. I had to go out on the internet and look and look and look. And finally I found what they meant by that. So this is a lot easier when you've got a reference guide where you go back and look it up. But, okay, and then it talks too about correcting errors. Now this is handy too. And it talks about all the different things you can do if you end up with maybe too many stitches, or if they get twisted, or you need to pick up a drop stitch. That's one thing I always get a little confused on. If I'm picking up a drop stitch, which side of the thing do I have to have the crochet hook on to make it either a purl or a knit stitch? And this talks about how to do that, and I think that is worth its weight in gold right there. It also has an introduction on how to block your finished stuff, which I think is great. Here's a picture of that showing how they got it pinned out. Now you can find any number of tutorials out on YouTube about blocking too, and I've used a number of those, and they have been very, very helpful. So I would recommend go out on YouTube and check that out when you're ready to block stuff. I never used to block things. I thought, why would I want to spend time on that? But I tell you, your stuff looks a heck of a lot better once it's blocked. And it fits better too. So yeah, it's worth taking that little extra time to block it out. Now the one thing I thought was really, really nice in this book, and I've just gotten into the designing part of it, is there's 3 sections in here on designing things. There's one on designing sweaters. There's a section on designing shawls, and another one on designing accessories. It really goes into a lot of detail on how to go about doing this. It explains the anatomy of each item, planning how much yarn you're going to need, the measurements that need to be taken to do this. Now, I don't believe I'll ever design my own sweaters, but I'd like to start designing maybe, I've got a shawl I'm working on right now, which is basically coming out of my head, but I'd like to maybe go back and design some more shawls where I have a little more control over what it's going to look like. And this will give you a lot of information on how to do that. A lot more than what I have. It also gives you schematics in here and worksheets and all sorts of really neat things. Here's a worksheet on the sweaters. It's got graph paper in there, or graph, so you could, make a copy of that and use that at home. It's got how to do your ribbing, how to design your ribbing, different types of sweater designs. Now, that other book that I showed you, my vintage book, also has something very similar to this on how to design collars and your neck shaping and all that. But this is more of an updated version of it for designing. Okay. The other section I wanted to show you real briefly is how to design shawls. It goes into a lot of detail on the different shapes of shawls, which I thought was very handy, and how to shape them when you're designing them, and the difference between a shawl and a stole, or a shawl and a wrap. Talks about that. Goes into detail on your triangular shawls, your asymmetrics, crescents, heart shapes, short rows, how to do those, and how to work with beads. Like I said, I got that vintage book that also talks about how to add beads to stuff, and this does too. Then the last section in here is designing accessories, and that would be like caps and hats. It gives the anatomy of a hat, the shaping, how to design them, how to block them. It also talks about mittens and gloves. Gives a lot of information on that. The same thing with the anatomy of them. Making fingerless gloves and mittens. Socks and stockings, anatomy of a sock. And here's a little bit on the caps and hats. Talks about the anatomy of the hat, different sections. This book I thought was, here's all sorts, it gives you types of hats in here, all sorts of hat types. I thought that was pretty neat. Very, very interesting. And it talks about how to measure a person's head to make a hat fit. Horizontally, around, and vertically. Anatomy of mittens and gloves. Here we go. I thought that was really very interesting. And it talks about how to measure too for those. Different types of thumb gussets, no thumb gusset, side seam gusset, or asymmetric thumb gusset. Didn't know there was such a thing. Shaped thumb gusset placed below index finger, and how to make the thumb. Thought that was pretty cool. Then there's also 3 different shapes for the mittens for the top of the mitten. There's a traditional, a sock top, and a round top. Did not know they had that. So that alone was worth taking a look at that. And there's also a little section in here on how to do thrumming. Now, you may have seen the thrumming a little bit on the internet recently, and I'd like to try my hand at that. That's where you take roving, and you basically hook it in with stitches inside the interior of the mitten. Makes the mitten a lot warmer. And here in Michigan in the wintertime, a thrum mitten would come in very handy. So I'm going to try that later on this season and see if I can make myself a pair of thrummed ones. But it also talks about making socks, the anatomy of a sock, and so on, and how to measure for that. It has Judy Becker's cast on how to Kitchener stitch the toes. And it also talks about how to do a toe up, toe down, the toe shaping, the heel shaping, all different types of heel shaping in here. And then it goes into a little detail in the next section on how to embellish. That would be embroidery, adding beads, how to do that in garter stitch, slip stitch, whatever. Put cords on things, do stockinette stitch on it with beading, sequins. And then it also has your fringe, how to add a fringe, putting a tassel, or making a tassel and putting a tassel on something, and how to do a pom-pom. And then the last section of this book is caring for your knitwear, how to clean it, fold, and store. So, I thought this book was really nice and very interesting, and I believe it's well worth what they're charging for it. It's $40. Great illustrations, great detail. A lot of detail, and it's written very well too. So if you're looking for a book and you're not interested in the vintage ones, but I said not everybody's into the old stuff. If you want a really nice, helpful new book, it shows up-to-the-minute techniques and pattern. It doesn't have any patterns in it really, but it's got a lot of really nice information where you could probably take this. It's kind of more like a recipe rather than a pattern. But you could probably glean enough from here where you could probably sit down and make your stuff without a pattern, especially something simple like maybe a simple hat or a shawl or possibly a scarf. But this book I thought was very, very well written. Thought it was very well put together and very well presented. So I would recommend this if you're looking for a very comprehensive knitting how-to book. It explains everything as well as a reference guide. And if you're getting into designing or think you might want to down the road, I would pick this up. And I will be getting a copy of this for my library. So I'm not associated with this company at all. I have bought a few of the Vogue Knitting magazines over the years, and I've liked those. But I'm not being compensated or anything by them. But I just thought I would mention this to anybody out there that might be interested in it. This is a very, very, very nice, comprehensive knitting guidebook. So anyway, that's that on that.